Welcome, everyone. Thank you for coming to this discussion this afternoon, and thanks to the Center for Palestinian Studies, who is co-presenting this event. We're here to welcome Andrew Ross back into Avery Hall and to discuss his new book, Stone Men, the Palestinians Who Built Israel, with us, the Who Builds Your Architecture Collective. And we've hosted Andrew before to discuss questions of labor and architecture, so it's nice to have you back, and we'll just to discuss your work. So Andrew's latest book is a deeply researched and reported account of stone, and more importantly, the people who work on and with it. He tells the story of Palestinian dispossession and Israeli settler colonialism from the vantage of Palestinian stonemasons. He tells the story of dispossession of land and of traditional craft, how architecture, style, and typology are implicated in pre-Israel Zionist push into Palestinian territory, and the current Israeli efforts to remove Palestinians from their land and their livelihood. He tells the story of statecraft and how the state constructs its own imaginary, whether through modernist urbanism, global tourism, or contemporary gentrification. Stoneman intimately connects questions of architectural labor, architectural style, global trade and migration, and state violence. And it's also beautifully written and is a real pleasure to read. Andrew is a professor of social and cultural analysis at NYU. He's a contributor to The Guardian, The New York Times, The Nation, and Al Jazeera, among many, many others. He is the author and editor of more than 20 books, including The Case for Debt Refusal, Bird on Fire, The Celebration Chronicles, and many more. And The Stone Men was the winner of the Palestinian Book Award. In addition, he's an activist involved in Strike Debt, Decolonize Displaced, and Gulf Labor, which is a project that was very influential and we could say the inspiration for Who Built Your Architecture. And in many ways, Andrew just embodies the activist spirit both within and beyond academia. And so joining me is to speak with Andrew is Who Built Your Architecture. WBIYA is a collection of architects, activists, scholars, and educators that tackles the pressing question, who builds our architecture? To examine the links between labor, architecture, and the global networks that form around building buildings. Over the years, we've installed exhibitions, published essays and articles, and published our own book, The Critical Field Guide, which unpacks many of these kind of thorny issues and is available on our website, whobuilds.org. And we do all this in the service addressing the role architects play within the labor systems that construct the buildings that we design. Our most recent exhibition opened this past fall at the Boston Architectural College, and representing WBYA today is Mabel Wilson and Lindsey Wikstrom from GSAPP and Kadambari Baxi from Barnard. So Andrew will speak for about 20 to 30 minutes, and we will have some follow-up questions, and then we'll open up and we will have questions from the audience. So please join me in welcoming Andrew.
Thank you so much, Jordan. And it's especially gratifying to be here with Who Builds Your Architecture, because I feel that this book really is part of a common project that we've all been involved in, as Jordan mentioned, for at least the last decade or so. that's based on research on labor and building infrastructure. You know, powerful people in government and industry and in our own professions are uncomfortable with this kind of research, and so they either ignore it or they try to shut it down. And in my case, or in the case of the Gulf Labor Coalition, which did a lot of work in Abu Dhabi, they really shut us down by denying several of us entry to the UAE in 2015. Now, that summer, several of us found ourselves in the West Bank. Some colleagues were making a film, and they'd asked me to come and interview workers at checkpoints going across the Green Line to Israel. And we realized we'd gone from taking testimony from migrant workers from another country or other countries in Abu Dhabi to taking testimony from migrant workers in their own land, which is basically what these Palestinian workers are. So related proposition, but quite different in some ways. I figured that this film is going to take a long time to make, and indeed it has. And so I could research and write a book in the meantime on this kind of work that might be useful. And I use the term useful because it's important when you're writing a book to ask yourself, how can this be a useful book? Because let's face it, there are a lot of useless books out there. Some of them I've written myself. And I don't mean unworthy, I just mean that they're books that people don't use in an active way, and I think we need to have that kind of literature and scholarship. So I did a lot of preliminary research to figure out how this could be useful, and there were two reasons I came up with. One was there's not a whole lot written about Palestinian labor. Palestine watchers, including scholars, tend to focus on other things like land theft and dispossession, displacement, demolitions, evictions, soldier brutality, human rights violations, mass incarceration, and so on and so forth, all for very good reason. But there's not a lot of scrutiny and attention to what Palestinians do on a daily basis to put food on the table for their families. So I figured I could help fill that gap, because a lot of what I do is labor research. The other reason I found was there's not a single published study of the stone industry in the West Bank of Palestine, which kind of astonished me because it's the largest private sector employer, and if you add in all the construction workers that work with this stone, in the aggregate, it's probably a larger number than the public sector payroll of the PA. It's the largest share of GDP and the largest share of exports from the occupied territories. And for such a small population, Palestinians are the 12th largest stone producer in the world, just behind the US and in front of Russia. Many of you probably know there are two natural resources that Palestinians have that Israel does not have. One is water. Much of that gets siphoned off using advanced pumping technologies from Jordan Valley and from the Central Mountain Aquifer. The other one is stone, limestone. Some of the best dolomitic limestone in the world, which is also in the Central Mountain area. And for the time being, at least, it's still largely under Palestinian control, which makes it a hugely important national resource. Here's a map of geological deposits. Depending on where you live, down the spine of that mountainous spine, your stone is the best stone, of course. I was quite agnostic about it in my research, but I became a stone fetishist in the course of doing this research. So what happens to it? Production-wise, there's about 1,200 firms in the industry, small family firms. And 75% of the stone ends up either inside the Green Line in Israel or in the settlements. What that means is, tragic paradox is that the very contents of Palestinian land are being used to build out the occupier state and also the spreading archipelago of settlements that stretch all over the West Bank. It's sometimes referred to as white oil, this stone, and like a lot of poor nations that have a rich natural resource, there's a resource curse that comes along with it, and Palestine is no exception. It's not well regulated as an industry, and environmentally speaking, it causes a great deal of damage. Those of you who visited the West Bank probably have seen the impact, the visual impact of the strip mining in the quarries, and also because it's so lightly regulated, it sickens the workforce in all sorts of ways, as I discovered in the course of my research. So the stone goes from, there's a line of supply that the stone follows. Doesn't go there unaccompanied. It's also unaccompanied. There's a dual journey going on of labor that follows the stone to construction sites. So I decided I was going to do interviews at every point in the chain with workers in the quarries, in the factories where the stone is cut and fabricated. Now, a lot of that work is now automated. In the workshops where it is finished and polished and also dressed. The surface of the stone is dressed in a number of ways. It's handcrafted work. It's artisanal still to some degree. And there's centuries of custom and tradition that go into that job. I also did interviews at the checkpoints going in, interviews at the construction sites in Israeli cities and suburbs of Tel Aviv and Jerusalem. I did interviews with workers coming back at the end of the shifts. You get a different kind of interview with people coming back from their work. And this is a very arduous journey. These guys are getting up at 3 or 4 o'clock in the morning and not getting back really to their homes till 9 o'clock at night, most of them. So very little time here. It's really from bed to work and from work to bed. Very little time to spend with their families, and they're in a great hurry to get home often. I also did interviews with workers who work in settlements in the West Bank, and most of them are in villages that are very close to the settlements. So as a result, they are working on land and sometimes on buildings that were formerly part of their villages, in fact, in some cases very recently. So you can imagine how difficult psychologically it is to do that kind of work. As I mentioned before, the companies are mostly small and family owned, so they're undercapitalized and underprofessionalized. There are families that have known each other for a long, long time because they're based in villages, so they compete with one another, but they do it very carefully. It's a capitalist economy, but it's not a cutthroat, predatory capitalist economy. There is another more well-known capitalist economy in the West Bank that is a crony capitalist circle of families very close to the Palestinian Authority who really perform the function of comprador capitalists, at least if you're following a Marxist analysis, and they basically monopolize the flow of utilities and provisions and goods from Israel to the West Bank. So they take their cut from that flow. And as far as I could tell, there's very little overlap between these two capitalist economies. That said, we're talking about capitalism. Some of you might not know that Palestine's basic law, forged in the wake of the Oslo Accords, puts the free market economy at the very center as a principle of the economy. I don't know of another country in the world that actually does that. So it's important to know. As a result, perhaps, the unions, trade union movement in Palestine has a very rich and fractious history, but the workers' union in the stone industry I found to be quite weak, mostly focused on health and safety, at least compared to the owners' union, which is the union of stone and marble. And there are all sorts of reasons for that weakness. I did a lot of interviewing in some of the new unions, the new independent unions that have sprung up in Palestine, fairly remote from the general trade union federation, and also some new unions likewise in Israel that are independent of Histadrut, which is the main trade union federation in Israel. And there's a certain amount of cooperation across the green line between these unions. It's not supposed to happen. It's very difficult, but it does occur. And occasionally there are some wins. Here, for example, is the Palestinian workers in an industrial zone in an Israeli settlement in the West Bank voting for the first collective bargaining contract in a settlement. And they were organized by an Israeli trade union, because Palestinian trade unions can't enter the settlements. And likewise, there have been a few wins on the other side, the green line. I interviewed a lot of owners of companies. When you're doing labor research, it's important not just to interview workers. You should interview employers. And like employers everywhere else in the world, they tend to complain about the same kinds of things, right? The workers are too lazy, they want too much money, and so on and so forth. But in the case of these owners, they also had a lot of complaints about the constraints that are placed on their enterprise by the occupation. And there are all sorts of constraints. Israel depends on this industry in a major way, but so it doesn't want to shut it down, but of course it will make it as difficult as possible to do business as usual especially in a profitable way. And so one of the examples I'll just mention is that Palestinian producers are not allowed to use explosives in the quarries, which puts them at a considerable competitive disadvantage with other producers in the region. Dynamite can shift a lot of stone in a very short space of time. Here they have to use this fairly primitive stone cutting machinery as a result. And what can you notice about this worker? No safety equipment, which I found to be fairly typical and routine for all sorts of reasons. And after the end of the interviews with owners, typically they would invite me back to their homes for a round of very warm Palestinian hospitality, which can take several hours. But after a while I realized, well, one of the reasons for this is to showcase their wealth to me. Because a lot of them were living in fairly lavish hilltop mansions, and they were proud of their wealth. Most of them are doing pretty well, actually, under the circumstances, at least compared to their workers. So, as you can imagine, a lot of the testimony I took had to do with the psychology of working for the occupier and the particular degrees of humiliation that are involved in that, and masculine humiliation in particular, because this is a masculine trade almost solely. There were some women I found working in management in the firms, and I interviewed them, but for the most part, this is a study kind of in masculine psychology. One of them mentioned to me there were all sorts of efforts on their part to summarize the asymmetry of power relations on the landscape, and one of them put it this way: we build their houses while they demolish our homes. He wanted me to be aware of the distinction between houses and homes there. They were also very much aware of how their livelihoods are tossed around as colonial bargaining chips. And the way this works is Israel issues work permits for Palestinians to come and work there on one condition, well, lots of conditions, but the main condition is that they keep the peace. If any member of their family or distant member of their family steps out of line, throws a stone at a soldier, ends up in jail, they lose their permit, which is a huge blow to their livelihood. So as you can imagine, this is a very effective form of what is thought of as economic pacification. Jobs for peace, social control over an occupied population, using labor as that instrument of control. All in all, however, I was mostly interested in the resilience of these workers. In spite of all the obstacles and indignities that are thrown in their paths on a daily basis, they resolutely show up for work, week after week, month after month, year after year. They've been doing this. And to me, in some ways, this was a reflection of the Palestinian resistance doctrine or philosophy, which is called sumud, or steadfastness, developed after the first Intifada. And Palestinians collectively said, we're not going to leave, we're not going to flee anymore, we're not going to become refugees anymore, we're going to stay here and keep on doing what we're doing as a form of resistance, everyday resistance. Stonemasons are a big part of the research. Palestinian craft of stonemasonry is a very venerable one. For centuries, Palestinian masons have been sought out for their superior artisanal skills. Every village would have a master mason who, without any professional training, designed and built fairly complex built environments. And this is an example, I guess, of what you would call today architecture without architects. They built palaces, they built hilltop villages that are much admired today. This is Al Buain, just north of Ramallah. They built township cores. This is Bir Zayt, near the famous Bir Zayt University. From the mid-19th century, they got into the business of city building. So they built Jaffa, they built Bethlehem, they built Khalil, they built Nablus, Haifa, and for the most part, they built Tel Aviv, the first Hebrew city. They got into the business of going further afoot, and they built other countries in the region. This is Amman and Jordan, which they built. And when the post-colonial Gulf states came calling, when they embarked on their nation-building drive, they got Palestinians to come and build their states too. The UAE and Saudi Arabia and Kuwait. Palestinians were the dominant workforce before South Asians were brought in as a migrant workforce. So it's fair to say that Palestinians have built almost every state in the region, except for their own, tragically. And that includes Israel. So the second part of my book really meant that I had to delve into the historical record to answer this question, who built Israel? And I think it's fair to say in the public mind the given wisdom is, well, of course, Jewish settlers built Israel, the pioneers. They were unused to manual labor, they learned on the job, they learned how to staff the cement mixers and balance the bricks on their shoulders, and they made new Jews of themselves according to the dominant doctrine at the time, which was labor Zionism. Now, if you leave aside some of the Zionist mythology about this and look into the record, it's a lot more murky than that. And for the longest time, it was obscured by the agrarian romance of the kibbutz, the communalistic kibbutz. Some of you might know something about the historical origins of the kibbutz. It was a solution to a problem that Jewish settlers had, which was, how do you extract a European standard of living from a Middle Eastern agricultural livelihood? Right? Not obvious answer to that question. And a lot of the efforts failed initially. It wasn't until the kibbutz was invented, so to speak, as a collective resource withdrawn from the marketplace, collective pooling of resources and consumption, that subsistence livelihood was found for these settlers. In the urban sector, it was even more murky. A lot of the Jewish settlers were socialists, so they demanded their workers' rights. They wanted what they called a European wage as opposed to an Arab wage, which was a prevailing market wage. And they managed to get the European wage through subsidies from world Zionist organizations that topped up the wage. And that in many ways is the origin of a long pattern of subsidy from world Jewry to Israel and its economy, which continues to this day. And of course the US government kicks in a huge part of that subsidy. There was a big campaign, which is important, a big campaign also going on called the Conquest of Labor campaign. Here I'm talking about the period between, say, 1910 and the late 1940s. Conquest of labor was this effort to, it was basically a boycott campaign. You know, when we think about boycott today, we think about BDS, right? This is a very long-running boycott campaign, and it's a boycott of Arab labor. It was an effort to put pressure on Jewish employers and foreign employers to have Jewish-only workforces and exclude Arabs from the workforce at the time. So a lot of sand and fury around it, but my research showed it was only ever partially successful. Why? Because employers always preferred Palestinian labor, and why would they not? The Palestinian workers were cheaper, they were better, more skilled, they had generations of construction experience, at least in the construction industry, in the region, and they were also less militant in their labor politics than the Jewish workers. So why, as an employer, why wouldn't you prefer that kind of workforce? But it's been an abiding preference, as I argue in the book. Let me give you an example of this. There's a case study in the book about Tel Aviv, which is instructive. Tel Aviv, as I'm sure some of you know, was a Jewish suburb of Jaffa. Jaffa is the biggest city in Palestine. It's the economic and cultural capital of Palestine. 100,000 people living there before the Nakba. After the Nakba, only 4,000 are left. The stonemasons of Jaffa use this stone, which is called kurkar. It's a sandstone. It's not like the limestone of the Central Mountains. Lithified sand dunes, basically. And they've been using this for centuries, and they dominate the labor market. So when the founders of Tel Aviv come along and say, we want to build this suburb, and their funders from world Zionist organizations say, we'll fund it, but we only want Jewish hands to build it, that's a big problem. Because how do you do that when all the skill is in the hands of the Palestinians and knowledge about this stone and its use and its craft is in the hand of Palestinians? So there was a little bit of labor conflict to begin with, and it was clear this wasn't going to work. And so employers often, when there's a labor conflict, they seek a technological solution in any workplace. And so this is what the founding fathers of Tel Aviv did. They decided to find a substitute for this stone. First of all, they tried silicate bricks. Increasingly, they used cement and concrete, materials that could more easily be used by Jewish workers. And over time, a cult of concrete developed in Israel, especially after 48. Concrete was supposed to be this tough and unyielding material, which reflected the character of the new nation of Israel. And today, the spread of concrete, the march of concrete across the hilltops of the West Bank is the unsavory brand mark of the occupation. But I tell you this story because the choice of the material, the initial choice of the material, was an effort to exclude the Arab workers from the workforce, and in many ways was a kind of origin of Arab-Jewish conflict in some ways over the decades. So at the same time as this cult of concrete's going on, after 48, there's a lot of architectural cleansing. I'm sure you've read about this. Demolition of villages, demolition of urban quarters, demolition of anything that is Ottoman, anything that is the built heritage of the region, and a flight of building away, flight of architecture away from the built heritage of the region in a way that owes nothing to that history. That comes to a stop in 1967, the flight away from the heritage. It comes to, not overnight, it's like a big ship turning, but over time it does turn away and moves in the opposite direction. Why is that? 1967, the occupation of the old city of Jerusalem happens. Israeli authorities are now in possession of a lot of old stone that they have to preserve. They can't bulldoze the old city of Jerusalem. They put the so-called biblical archaeologists to work. They dig down, they excavate until they reach a historical layer that they argue corresponds to the landscape of Jewish antiquity. They throw away a lot of the other layers, in violation of cultural heritage rules, because that's the layer that they're interested in. So as a result, Israeli Jews begin to look at the old stones of Palestine through new eyes. Right? The old stones are no longer seen as crumbling remnants of a backward civilization that have to be demolished and thrown away. They're now seen as kind of magical pathways to this landscape of Jewish antiquity, which is all important as it's a birthright landscape. So that's mostly Jerusalem. Jerusalem is very religious, driven by, there's a religious project going on. In Tel Aviv, which is much more secular, there's something similar happening. Old stone and mortar buildings are being revalued and restored, but not for religious reasons, but for real estate purposes, for market value. As in most parts of the world, industrial parts of the world, we think of this, we associate it now with gentrification. There's a reevaluation of taste and an elevation of vintage features of decor and facade for real estate purposes. So that's what happens is happening in Tel Aviv, and especially in Jaffa, where you have condo restorations that are going on that also include Arab vernacular architectural features, the kind that would have been shunned not long before. And when I started my report, I call this Ottomania, this whole, this fever for all things Ottomanian. when I started reporting there in about 2015, some of the old houses around the old city of Jaffa were fetching the highest real estate prices in Israel, which is really a mindfuck, because only a few years before, these were houses that were being demolished and the rubble piling up in the beaches of Jaffa. And lo and behold, Kurkar, which was the stone that Tel Avivians had shunned a century before, is back in hot demand. Can't get enough of Kurkar. There's not a lot of it left. And workers also who can work with Kurkar are few and far between. So if you move 25 kilometers east, you cross the Green Line, you're in the West Bank. There's also a campaign of architectural restoration going on. It's not being driven by the market. Stone and mortar buildings, traditional buildings, don't yet have a lot of value on the real estate market. They might well do, but currently they don't. It's being driven by revival of cultural heritage, bulwarks against the Palestinian bulldozer, which can be just as destructive as the Hebrew bulldozer, so-called. There are also bulwarks against settlers seizing land. If you get a building historically listed, it's more difficult in some ways for the settlers to seize it. And these are what are called Palestinian facts on the ground, evidence of long-standing residence, which Palestinians have to actually prove in some instances that they've been here for decades and centuries. It's also feeding into a rural revival in certain areas. So I study three organizations that were doing this kind of restoration work: Riwaq, which is probably familiar to most of you, in Ramallah, the Center for Cultural Heritage Preservation in Bethlehem, and the Old City Revitalization Program in Jerusalem. Different locations, different kinds of work, but a common purpose, I think. And also a common techniques involved. Here's one example. I think this is a restoration done by Riwaq. This is Jabba, a village to the east of Jerusalem, the old core, before and after. As you can see, quite a transformation. I also interviewed a lot of workers who were employed on these restoration projects. Some of them were old-timers like this fellow, and some of them were younger and learning on the job from the old-timers. Now, just to try and conclude, as a result of the historical research, my conclusion was that Palestinians have been an indispensable part of this workforce for a century or more. We're talking about a century of labor contributions to the building of almost every fixed asset on the land between the river and the sea. There have been three major attempts to replace Palestinians over the course of this century. The first was the conquest of labor, which I already mentioned. The second was after 1948, after the Nakba, the importation of Mizrahi Jews from Arab countries around the region to take their place in the workforce. Didn't last long. And the third one was a collective punishment for the first Intifada. Israel decided to replace the workforce by importing large numbers of migrant workers from overseas. Each in their turn has only ever been partially successful, and today, according to my research, we're at a numerical height of employment, which is to say there are more West Bank Palestinians working in Israel and the settlements than ever before. And what do you get from that? This is the last, is an argument I put forth at the end of the book. It's a very speculative argument, but I thought I would throw it out there, having done all this research. What rights accrue to you for a century or more of these labor contributions? And what additional rights of restitution are due to you from having been fashioned into a compulsory workforce, where there is really no alternative to doing this kind of work economically, because of Israelis' policies of underdeveloping the Palestinian economy? The alternative is often a starvation wage. So I use the term compulsory because we're not talking about forced labor here, and we're not talking about bonded labor, as we might do in the case of migrant workers in the Gulf. but compulsory because of the lack of an alternative. So what I suggest is this principle of political sweat equity, which rests upon the idea that if you build a country, that should translate into some rights in that country, civil and political rights. And since we're in the business now of talking about, the unitary state, the one-state solution, how will these rights claims figure into that solution? If there ever is a return to the bargaining table between Israelis and Palestinians, and I know it's very difficult to envisage at this point in time, but if there is a return to the table, all of the old claims of Palestinians will still be on the table. Rights for property, rights, reparations from property losses in the Nakba, compensation for decades of moral suffering since then and continuing losses, the right of return of refugees, all of these claims that you may have heard about, they'll still be on the table, and they are unpaid debts from the past, and in my opinion at least should be repaid. But that is reparative justice. Transitional justice is how do we get from here to somewhere else, to the unitary state, one-state solution. You need to put new claims on the table to make that transition. And it's not as if the old ones have been working all that well, right? So I'm suggesting or speculating at the end of the book that this argument about political sweat equity, an argument for labor-based equity, could be one of those claims. Not to displace the others, but a supplementary claim, a new one, an additional one, and we need more. And there are more. We just need to do research on it. You might ask yourself, well, or you might ask me, well, how has that worked in other places in the world? Right? Because Israel's not the only country that was built by enslaved and bonded and indentured workforces, including this one, of course. African American and Irish and Chinese and Mexican workforces, populations, have, to one degree or another, over the years, made similar kinds of claims on the basis of their labor. They haven't gotten an immediate response, but over time, I think, the moral force of the argument has helped to translate into fuller social inclusion and citizenship and civil rights. The difference is that I've been talking about populations that were brought from elsewhere, whether against their will or because there were no other opportunities available to a country to build it. In the case of Palestine, we're talking about people building in their own country. And so the moral force of this argument, I think, is stronger and gets magnified as a result. So I want to leave you with this one quote, because it's important to leave you with a worker's voice and words. This fellow was standing in line at the checkpoint. He was waiting to go over there and to the green line, across the green line. He said, I've been building homes every day over there for 30 years. In a way, it's really my country too, isn't it? And I thought, yeah, that's a very elegant way, concise way of putting it. And the argument I've been making much more elegant in a way than the $25 words I've been using. So I wanted you to leave you with those words. Thank you.
Your use of architecture, like what we think of as capital A architecture, right? You call the building in Tel Aviv the Bauhaus-inspired concrete boxes a type of ethnic cleansing. And you link a lot of the building in Jaffa and contemporary building practices to the various neoliberalisms that are taking over Israel and Palestine. And so I'm wondering, then you contrast this with the Iraq and some of the preservationist programs. So I'm wondering if you see a kind of third way for architectural practice that is not necessarily historicist or preservationist, but also not implicated within a kind of neoliberalism and gentrification and many of the development patterns that you write about in their kind of most exploitative fashions. So in this room, I'm thinking about the profession moving forward in a different way, aside from kind of a preservation model.
Oh, well, it's a good question. I don't know if I'm well qualified to really to give guidance on it. That would be more for experts in the room, I think, in the profession. I didn't have that much truck with the architecture. I mean, other than decolonizing architecture, which is very marginal in the profession, but they do great work. And Sharon Rothbard was a very important resource for me. For those of you who don't know his book, Black City, White City, about Tel Aviv, absolutely indispensable book for helping to, among other things, take apart the myth of the white city of Tel Aviv, and delve into the politics of the border between Jaffa and Tel Aviv historically and to this day. And his personal ethics, I can't speak for him, but as far as I understand it, is that he would not work on a project that was either on state land, a lot of Israeli land is state land, or a project that was funded in any way with state money, which left him with a very limited slice of business as an architect, very limited indeed. But I think like decolonizing architecture, he's a bit of an outlier. But I'm sure there are people here who know of others who could add to that list. It might be instructive.
Sure. We're starting with corners. So I wanted to go back to, I guess it was really interesting to hear your idea of the useful book. And, I think it's really, reading through some of this book, I really felt it was books within books in a way, because there's so much research and information here that's really interesting. So one thing I did want to kind of, in addition to this very powerful central core argument, I think there are chapters that are really approaching kind of different angles. And maybe if we could just go back to one chapter, which is human gold. Is that right? What was the title? When the worker, I believe that's quotation.
That was the president of the Bethlehem Chamber of Commerce. I think it was a quote from him.
Was it? Yeah. And it really struck me because that if we could perhaps expand on, that is a kind of a quotation, but also it was interesting, and we touched on your presentation a little bit in terms of Palestinian workers, but more in the kind of contemporary, recent histories, also the guest workers, and other kind of migrant workers that were there building. But this really kind of almost this sort of contrast between those workers and what they were going through, and then Palestinian workers, and this sort of idea of his, them saying that Palestinian workers were human gold, and if you could expand on that.
Yeah, I will try. It's a very important question, because you might ask yourself, from what you know about migrant workers from overseas, that you would figure that Israeli employers would prefer their labor because of the circumstances under which they labor, and surely they're cheaper. And under labor discipline in a way perhaps that even Palestinian workers are not. They do tend to share work sites with the Palestinians. There's a lot of conjecture about who's paid more, if anyone is paid more, especially about the Chinese workers. There are a lot of Chinese workers in Israel who are the most heavily indebted, actually, in terms of bonded labor. I mean, some of them rack up $30,000 worth of debt just to get there, and usually labor under false pretenses, false promises. Is typical with migrant workers in the construction industry. But maybe I could just try and answer the question directly. Why would Israeli employers prefer Palestinian workers over these migrant workers? Well, there are a number of reasons. One is migrant workers send their wages home, for the most part, in the form of remittances, right? Palestinian workers take their wages home to the West Bank, but then they buy Israeli goods at Israeli prices with their wages. So that's a win-win for the Israeli economy, right there. That's one of the reasons they're human gold. Another reason is a lot of them can speak some Hebrew, so that's an advantage to the employer. And some of them have been working for a long time with their families if they have a relationship with certain employers, so that helps. They also go home every night. I mean, they're commuters, and there's a commuter workforce in a way. So they're not a social burden on the state in any way, shape, or form, as migrant workers are perceived to be increasingly, because right-wing Israelis consider them to be a sort of demographic threat, especially since so many of them have outlasted their visa and gone underground, so they're undocumented at this point. Palestinians, no burden on the state. And another reason, which is more of a long-term one, not a conspiracy theory, has to do with the transfer of labor off the land in the West Bank. As more and more family members get inducted into wage labor in the Israeli economy, their attachment to the land gets weakened over the decades, really. We're talking about several decades. And as a result, just makes it easier for settlers to take over that land. And that's one of the reasons why right-wing Israelis in particular, politicians, are very much in favor of this policy of employing Palestinians and are always pushing for more and more work permits because they think it's a great policy and is a huge boon to settlers. So that's some of the reasons I could offer for the human gold description.
Yeah, that's a great question. And just to follow up, I mean, thank you so much for joining us today. I think it's a pleasure to really have time to sit and think about how people are connected to buildings. You know, buildings seem to crop up along this timeline just for such a brief moment. And some of the work at the school, right, is looking at how materials and people coalesce into architecture for a moment, and then how it might be deconstructed. So I think the way that you framed, your talk today, looking at where things are extracted, how material is processed, who's involved, I think it's very useful to think about architecture being connected to all of these models of economies and, I'd say, habits. And I really appreciated you digging into the everyday. I thought that, framing of a worker's everyday life, getting up in the morning, going here, and then that continuous, for a century, thinking of how the effect of the everyday, can have on territory. So I thought, one question, I had two questions. First was, how do you imagine, I guess if you had to say the usefulness or the use case for an architect to open this book and use it, how would you imagine that happening? Do you imagine that architects should get closer to designing supply chains, designing the factory, designing the excavation? And then also maybe more about the interviews, the everyday life of workers and residents. Do they, talk about things that they wish they were doing? Were there other interests or jobs? Since now, after such a long period of time, the skills are very specific. I'm curious if there's, interest in, I wish I was a scientist.
Right. Yeah. I did always ask, especially at my checkpoint interviews, I did hundreds of those in various checkpoints. I did always ask, at the end of the interview, what's your dream? a very open-ended question. And it was the most difficult question for them to answer, quite frankly. It took me a long time to try and, I still haven't figured out why, other than the obvious. Their aspirations and their dreams, they have very low expectations. But some of them were quite humorous in their response, They wanted to marry their boss's daughter or, play for Barcelona Football Club or whatever. Others were, a lot of the responses were about normality, that they wanted a normal life. And this word kept coming up. And you would think, well, that's a low bar. But actually, if you're in their position, and seeing the world through media's eyes and seeing the rights and the mobility and the access that their counterparts have in the rest of the world, most parts of the rest of the world are heavily represented in the media. That's what normality is, and that's what they don't have. They don't have the privilege of being able to travel to from one village to another very easily or unimpeded, for example. And so that's one of the reasons why normality was, I think, the answer to that question. There wasn't a lot of politics involved in their answers to questions. And I didn't really probe in that. I wasn't particularly interested in that. Interestingly, when women did come through the checkpoints, and we did manage to persuade them to talk, they tended to be more politically articulate. Perhaps because they were more educated and involved in more sort of white-collar type employment. That said, we met a lot of folks standing in line who were college educated, who were going to work in the construction industry. They just couldn't find jobs that were remunerative in the West Bank on the basis of their college educations. Plus, they racked up quite a bit of student debt in the course of getting a degree. So there were a lot of highly educated folks also standing in line. The first question is a big one. I think I would just stick to what I said about rights. Because I think it's a question that Who Built Your Architecture has asked and continues to ask. This sort of sweat equity question. How far can and should the rights of workers go in terms of recognition, but even further? And I think it can be answered in all sorts of ways. The labor theory of property on which labor Zionism is based, it's a settler colonial doctrine, really, that goes back to John Locke, right? You work on land, you mix your labor with the soil, property rights is the outcome. This is a very serviceable doctrine in this country for settlers. Labor Zionism is simply another version. Doesn't refer directly to Locke, but the labor Zionist doctrine, settler colonial doctrine, is based on a labor theory of property. And to some degree, the argument I was making at the end about labor-based rights could be construed as a version of that, but there's no reason why settlers should have a monopoly on the labor theory of property, right? I mean, squatters' rights all over the world, adverse possession rights, the landless movement in Brazil. There's all sorts of examples of populations that put claims on property through their labor and their possession. And they're not necessarily settlers. In fact, they're not settlers by most definitions. So I think for me, the answer to the question, really, just to long story short, would be to open up this issue of worker rights beyond those that pertain to, wage labor. Wage labor alienates workers from the product of their labor and limits the claims that they can make to workplace claims, simply, and nothing beyond, despite the fact that they produce all this surplus value and they don't get paid the true value of their labor. So we could have a bigger conversation about that, I think. Who built your architecture?
Actually, I mean, it's great that you sort of ended up with, you sort of veered toward that, because that was related to my question, and I'm just going to make maybe a quick question, maybe even a statement, and we can open it up, because I've been thinking about that. I mean, it really, I mean, I recommend buying this. It's actually on sale in the back of the room, but it really is incredibly precise what Kadambari said. It's like, it's multiple books. I mean, the history is incredibly thorough, the labor analysis, the analysis of various construction industries. I mean, it really kind of gives us a geography, a very complex material, social, and political geography, of what's going on. And it fills in, just so many blanks about, like, really, how does this come into being? Which often in media, you just think, oh, that's just how it is. But, it's actually both by design and constructed over time. But I guess my question goes back to that issue of make the desert bloom, and the connection of that idea with nationalism. Because it seems to me citizenship and nationalism are precisely where one finds rights, and when you're dispossessed or disallowed that position and that opportunity, how do you gain that? How even if you are mixing your sweat with the land in order to claim property, it seems like the concept of property is already exclusive, it's violent, it's white, it's, and that the law and the nation state do a lot of work to maintain that integrity. So how do you work against that?
Well, again, very important question, a big one, and I think it's important to recognize that any settler state needs to appeal to laws wherever they can find them. And just as settlers in this country, went back to the Norman yoke, they used the Code of Conquest. There are all sorts of legal codes that they use to justify their expropriation of land. One of the things the Israeli state does is very selective about its use of Ottoman law, Ottoman land law. A lot of Ottoman land law has been rejected because it's not particularly useful. Some laws
which has allowed a lot of people to make claims to the land. The land wasn't laying fallow, people were actually using the land and recognized through Ottoman law as using the land.
Right. On both sides.
Mm-hmm.
On both sides, those who wanted to stay on their land and also those who wanted to seize it. Their original motivation of the Ottoman land reforms was to facilitate tax collection, of course. An imperial mode of extraction, but the Israeli customary law now includes this very important, for settlers at least, this very important law regarding underutilization of land. If it can be proved or proven that the land hasn't been it's been fallow for 3 years, hasn't been properly improved, it's much easier for the state to seize the land, and that happens on a regular basis in the West Bank. It's a very true, and that relates to the point I made earlier about more and more household members getting inducted into wage labor, and they're not farming anymore. So the land is fallow as a result, and under this law it can be seized. It's not simply a matter, however, of saying, well, I'm going to make sure that all this land is actually plowed and worked on, although it has contributed into a sort of rural revival. Part of the cultural heritage revival in the West Bank has to do with food security and alleviating food security by generating, facilitating local food supply in rural areas. So that's sort of pushback, and it has consequences which are quite consequential.
So any questions from the audience?
Thank you.
I think there is a mic.
Oh. Thank you for what sounds like a phenomenal book. Thank you for writing it, doing the hard work, and thank you for bringing it to our attention. I have a question that pertains a little bit, I think, it's a very selfish question in response to your usefulness of the book. I'm just going to ask a question that is useful for me in certain ways, but relates, I think, in certain ways to the question of dispossession and the making of the claims, the claims of the worker. And I'm fascinated by the way that you presented sort of the two aspects of your book in terms of the research, the more ethnographic, contemporary research, but also the historical part of the book. And as someone who's involved more in history than in contemporary times, I would love to hear you talk about the challenges that exist when you're looking for the claims of the dispossessed historically as opposed to contemporary conditions. In the first part, you talked a lot about the oral histories and being on the field, and that sort of methodological explanation kind of faded away in the history part, which I'm sure is not accidental. And I'd love to hear you talk about the mechanisms that are put in place for those methodologies to not be explicit, I guess.
Okay, that's a difficult one.
Since I have you in the room,
I know. No, I talk about the methodology and people-based work, which is what I mostly do. But there's always a historical component to the work that I do, because I find to answer the questions you really have to take a much longer view, which is very much the case here. I could have just done the interviews and left it at that. But I had to go into the historical record, and quite frankly, most of the sources are secondary sources. I did a few interviews with, stone worker families in Palestinian stone worker families in Israel, whose families have been working for generations, and obviously, survived the Nakba. Managed to stay in the property. So there were some oral history sources, but for the most part, there were secondary sources. And I was faced with this dilemma: was I going to go into the Israeli Labor Archive? And decided it probably was not worth my time, because a lot of this labor activity would not be documented. A lot of it is casual labor. And there were all sorts of other reasons, probably, why it would not be, recorded and accounted for. So I could have spent a lot of time in the archives trying to do that, and really not coming up with much. That's not to say it couldn't be done or shouldn't be done. I didn't have I didn't think it was worth it for me to do this project. But I'd like to see some of that work, because I don't think it really has been done, astonishingly. So that's about as much as I can say about the method. I have had historians who read the manuscript. My colleague Zach Lockman, who's an authority in the particular area, he read the manuscript and passed muster. I felt, okay, good enough for Zach, good enough for me. So maybe that's, it's just my sense of the threshold that you have to reach to get something out there that might be useful. But probably not that helpful, but it's the truth.
Yeah.
Thanks for the talk. I mainly had a question about the title of the book, because I was both very struck and moved by it, Stone Men, particularly the second word, men, and kind of generally to see the opposite side of that word, to ask if you look much into the role of the family and the labor of the wives of these men in kind of the professional reproduction of that labor. And also, I was really fascinated by the part where you spoke about the masculine psychopathology of these workers working for the occupier, and I was wondering or curious if you're able to find out anything about how that plays out within the family as opposed to on the work side or in the factory.
Yeah, I mean, I couldn't really access the household sphere, being who I am and having limited access. I couldn't have done the research without translators because I don't speak Arabic, and I used colleagues, comrades from Aida refugee camp in Bethlehem, whom I got to know, and I employed them as translators. And I really wanted to acknowledge them because the book couldn't have been written without them. And you know, refugees know everyone. They certainly knew everyone in the stone industry. Everyone has a brother or a cousin or whatnot, and one thing led to another. So they were really crucial for me in getting access. But because of who I am, I really couldn't, go beyond the homosocial sphere of the household and get into the business of reproductive labor. It should be done, that kind of work, and I think some accounting of reproductive labor of the household economy should also figure in this argument, if it goes any further, this argument for labor-based rights. Again, because of who I am, I couldn't get access to that. So it's not really in the book to some degree. We did a lot of interviews in workers' homes, in villages after they come back from work. They maybe had an hour and a half, and we got them during that hour and a half. And word would get round the village that this was going on, something was happening in such and such's house. So other men would come in and join the conversation, and it often turned into what felt like group therapy for a lot of the men in the room. And they talked about things they might not have otherwise. That was my impression. And especially they began to talk about the health and safety challenges in the industry, which are considerable. I mean, it's very well documented the occupational hazards and illnesses associated with working with stone. They didn't work with health and safety equipment. So, topics like cancer, which are very much taboo topics in this culture, in the Stone Village culture, they touched upon in the course of these conversations, and I could tell that these were uncommon topics to be discussed, and they are in Beit Jala Hospital, for example, in Bethlehem. Someone told me that 80% of the cases of men in there at any one time are associated with stone industry illness. And there's no records kept of that, so there was no documentation of that. So there was a lot of talk that revolved around these kinds of topics, which felt it wouldn't have happened on an individual basis, and I felt fortunate to have been able to be a catalyst for those conversations. So they're also documented to some degree in the book. So group masculinist psychology. Sounds bizarre.
Thanks for coming today. I have a question about the sustainability of the industry.
About the what?
Sustainability of the industry.
Oh, yeah.
You just mentioned it's health and hazards.
Yeah.
Associated with the stone industry, and also you mentioned that this one stone is really valuable, but it's getting depleted. And you also mentioned that many of the skills are very particular and specific. So does that mean that some of these, a large part of this labor force will be running out of jobs very soon?
Mm-hmm.
And also, does that mean with the environmental hazards associated with it, that stone industry should not be so much of a asked it, like, how is there a pivot for this that you see, like pivoting away from quarrying and stone?
That's better? Okay, sorry. Yeah, these are good questions. First of all, it's important to say that Israel outsourced this industry in a way after 1967. There used to be quite a few quarries in Israel itself. No one wants to live near a quarry. It's a dirty industry. So to some degree, the Palestinian producers were invited to industrialize after 67. And one of the reasons why the Israeli stone demand is a mainstay for the industry has to do with a municipal ordinance that was laid down in 1919, I think, by the British governor of Jerusalem, Ronald Stores. It decrees that all of the buildings in Jerusalem have to be faced with Jerusalem stone, which is the local limestone. And that's been very consequential. As Greater Jerusalem is spread out and now reaches far into the West Bank, all of the buildings are faced with this stone in a way to send a sort of ideological message about the indivisibility of Jerusalem. So it's a very political use of facade. But because of the outsourcing of a dirty industry, and stone is not the only one that's outsourced, all of Israel's dirty industries are pushed across the green line into the settlement industrial zones. It is this sort of does present these occupational hazards. I found that and sustainability is a big challenge because internationally that is a challenge for the stone industry. It's not happening in the West Bank. Decolonizing Architecture actually produced a very interesting report for the Palestinian Authority, which recommends adaptive reuse of some of the quarries, which is becoming more and more the norm in certain countries. Hasn't happened so far in the West Bank. I focused a few pages in the book on efforts to recycle the slurry that is a waste product of the stone industry into building bricks. There's an engineer I found in Hebron who was doing this, who sort of figured out a way to do this, and so I spent a few pages pushing his project in a way. But it's a big challenge. And I've forgotten your other question. Excuse me.
I guess it was sustainability both for the workforce as well as for the future of the industry as it pertains to the environment.
Oh, right. It was about also your supply. You're talking about supply. That's a very good question because most of the remaining stone resources are located in Area C, which, for those of you who know about Area A, B, and C in the West Bank, Area C is a major portion of the West Bank. It's wholly under Israeli military and civic control. It makes it very difficult for Palestinian producers to quarry there. Some of them do on a cowboy basis. On Fridays and Saturdays, when the soldiers are not there, they sneak in and bring their machinery in and they extract around the clock. It's pretty hazardous to do it, and you have to bribe the soldiers also. There's a lot of bribery involved in this industry in regard to communications and relationships with the Israeli military. But that's where most of the remaining stone is. It's unclear what's going to happen to it. It's still sort of up in the air, totally under Israeli control. Who knows how much of Area C would be annexed, if any aspect of the Trump peace plan was implemented. But so there's a lot of conjecture. And that's the future of the industry and the source of supply. So, nothing definitive there.
Maybe one more?
I just want to comment on her question. the pulkal is a sandstone that is on the shore, so it's not in the area of sea, and it's protected because there are not many left, so that's why they're not building. And it's actually very expensive to build with it because there are very few left that you can actually build with. Thank you.
Yeah, no, thank you for clarifying that. The examples I found of people working with Carver were mostly not newly quarried stone, but finding old stone from demolished buildings in different parts, different villages, different parts of Israel, because they're so valuable now.
It's protected. You're not allowed to make quarries from that stone anymore.
Right. But there, as won't surprise you, there is an industrial substitute. You know, that passes muster architecturally in a place like Jaffa. It's sort of artificial, synthetic Kurkar. It looks like it, just to preserve the palette of the, you know, the idea is for Jaffa to look like a sort of quaint Mediterranean village, seaside village.
Hi, thank you for your talk. I had a question kind of going back to Professor Wilson's point about the political sweat equity take. How would that work in relation to thinking of the rights of refugees or Palestinians in the diaspora who may have never been to Palestine and, you know, haven't participated in this idea of labor equity? And also how, I mean, if we think of the one of the originating myths of Zionism, a land without people for people without land, it was very much about people not cultivating the land, you know, not being civilized laborers, and, you know, defining people in relation to property, as Professor Wilson was saying. So, I mean, how would that idea of political sweat equity not participate in this redefining or discursive definition of Palestinians in relation to property, in relation to land, and work for Palestinians on land?
Okay, the refugees, well, let me say this, when I've given this book talk in a number of different locations, and invariably there's a Palestinian in the audience, someone of Palestinian heritage, who says, my grandfather was a stonemason. Like, is there anyone here who corresponds to that description? That's not untypical. These are refugee families, of course. Because stonemasonry was such a central part of the culture, they all have stonemasonry in their family background, and so it's not just the population, the landed population in occupied territories that is covered by these right-based claims. Although, as you probably know, there is a lot of tension between who gets this say in the rights, in the promotion and the definition of rights, and the refugee families do feel that they're often, excluded or are given secondary considerations in that regard. With respect to the second part, everyone in Israel and the occupied territories knows this story. The Palestinians built Israel and everything else. Everybody knows it. It's just not officially acknowledged anymore. And is there a lot of guilt and shame among Israeli Jews about this history, that their foremothers and forefathers were supposed to have built this country, but maybe didn't do a lot of it, didn't do a lot of the building? Difficult to say. I don't have a lot of insight into psychology or the mentality that I'm describing here, but every so often there is an effort to try to get Israeli Jewish workers back into the industry. The trade unions every so often launch a campaign to do so. Histotrip does it every few years or so. Sometimes it's targeted at Orthodox Jewish workers, which have a low workforce participation rate. But to get them back into, the business of building, which was so hallowed part of Zionist mythology. And every time the campaign is launched, it fails miserably. even when the wages promised are much higher than the market wage in the industry, and they usually are, as an appetizer, as a teaser to bring the workers in, usually fails because it's seen as Arab work. And Israeli Jews don't do Arab work. They don't do Arab labor. And that's not, there are equivalents in this country and in many industrialized countries when it comes to construction work, of course. But there's a very political valence that's attached to that issue in Israel for reasons that probably should be obvious. Yeah. Thank you.
It's 2:30. I know that there was some desire to do a stop time at 2:30, but if you'd like to continue, there's clearly lots of people in the audience who will continue to ask questions.
I know there was another question here, so why don't we take one last question, and then Andrew can stick around for perhaps a minute or two, and we can speak afterwards or now about.
Thanks so much for your talk. You mentioned crony capitalism in one of the earlier slides, and talked about Creditocracy in particular. Was there any evidence of attempts to consolidate in the industry? And is there some unique character to it that has prevented that from occurring? And how might that change arguments with relation to collaboration with settlers and space?
Yeah, that's a good question. There's a couple of firms that have managed to capitalize themselves on a scale where they can more efficiently export. I mean, the biggest one is NASA in Bethlehem, and Nassar is the he's a champion of the industry. He's been involved in these efforts to try and rebrand Jerusalem Stone in certain ways. There's a big political contest over what the name Jerusalem Stone and whether it can be locally branded, like champagne. If you go to China, the Chinese are very good at expropriating. They come to Palestine and they buy out flood stone, they take it back to China, pulverize it, and they produce this sort of synthetic stone, which they sell at Jerusalem Stone. If you go to Xiamen, which is the stone industry capital in China, you can actually buy it on Alibaba if you go there. So there are one or two firms that have risen above a certain threshold of scale. There are also, however, there's a large part of my book that is about the city of Rawabi, which is this huge, Palestinians often refer to it as Palestinian settlement on a hill above Ramallah. Everyone has an opinion about Rawabi. But Bashar Mazri, who's the CEO of the company, and his family is a very central part of Creditocracy, the crony capitalist, is the developer there, and it's a very interesting case study. He doesn't have. He located some quarries actually nearby, so they do use locally sourced stone that doesn't come from the existing industry. So it is more vertically integrated. So that's the one example where parts of the industry do overlap with one of the crony capitalist enterprises. But it's the only one that I know of, really. So it's a special case, but Rawabi is a special case for all sorts of reasons. For those of you who don't know about it, it's worth looking into.
So I want to thank all of you for spending lunchtime with us, and thank Andrew for being here, for writing the book, and which is for sale back in National Book Award. Thank you.